All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're breaking down a pretty fascinating Al Jazeera documentary that takes a hard look at a very common historical narrative. We so often hear the phrase empty land tossed around when people talk about this region before the mid-20th century. But this documentary, it presents a radically different picture. By pulling together historical accounts, data, and some really detailed regional histories, the source material aims to show us the deep, bustling physical and cultural infrastructure of pre-1948 Palestine. We're going to look at exactly what was built, who was building it, and how society actually functioned during this completely transformative era. Now, according to the source material, to truly understand the sweeping events of 1948, we've got to map out the crucial milestones first. The documentary actually takes us all the way back to the late 19th century, specifically 1892, with a major infrastructure milestone. From there, it moves through the geopolitical shifts that kicked off in 1920, highlights a massive international gathering in 1931, and then culminates in the huge societal changes of 1948. So here is our roadmap for unpacking the documentary's claims today. First up, connected infrastructure and trade. Second, cultural and economic prosperity. Third, a surge in education. Fourth, the British Mandate era. And finally, the 1948 infrastructure shift.
Okay, let's get into Section 1, Connected Infrastructure and Trade. The documentary kicks things off by painting a picture of a really deeply connected society, and they trace a massive economic boom back to one specific, highly celebratory event. It highlights the monumental opening of the Jerusalem Railway in 1892. The source describes this as just an unforgettable day. A high-level delegation arrived all the way from Astana, which is modern-day Istanbul, representing the Ottoman government. In Jerusalem, you had ambassadors, consuls, prominent local families, and just massive crowds waiting around for 3 hours, enjoying food and drink, all just to witness the arrival of this train. It was the very first time the coast was officially and modernly linked to the interior city. And it's an event, the documentary claims, completely kick-started a comprehensive economic boom. And this infrastructure quickly expanded way beyond just a single track. Soon enough, the railway connected Jaffa not just to Jerusalem, but up to Beirut, Damascus, and even down to Cairo. The documentary notes that this network was so seamless, a resident in Jaffa could literally hop on a train and go have breakfast with friends on Hammer Street in Beirut, which honestly is a level of connectivity that's pretty wild to think about today. Meanwhile, the ports, especially up in Haifa, became these bustling global hubs linking Africa, Asia, and Europe, drawing in tens of thousands of workers from all across the Middle East. And locally, industries were just booming to support all this. We're talking advanced manufacturing companies that were actually building the metal bodies for buses and commercial vehicles right there.
Moving right along to Section 2, cultural and economic prosperity. So, as you might guess, when you have capital flowing and people moving around easily, culture inevitably follows right behind. The documentary uses some incredible sensory details to bring this history to life. For example, as phonographs and record players began spreading globally in the 1920s, the source points out that Palestinian society was actually among the first in the entire region to adopt them. The emergence of local record production companies meant that if you were walking through the daytime streets and markets of Jaffa, the air was literally filled with the music of famous Arab, particularly Egyptian, singers, just echoing out of homes and shops for hours on end.
The crucial point the film is making here is that society wasn't just scraping by, it was thriving. The capital generated from trade allowed for investments well beyond the basic necessities. Cinemas, for instance, weren't just showing films. The documentary points out they doubled as massive cultural and political meeting halls for live performances and rallies. Even in the sports world, the region was highly competitive. The documentary specifically highlights Palestinian athletes securing Middle East boxing championships, taking down top-tier competitors from Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt.
All right, let's dive into Section 3, a surge in education. Let's explore how all this cultural prosperity translated into what the documentary describes as an educational revolution. They present some pretty dramatic data on this slide. The source claims that at the dawn of the 20th century, literacy in Palestine was hovering around a mere 2%, mostly limited to the clergy and a few elites. But fast forward to 1948, and youth literacy had skyrocketed to an impressive 50%. The documentary attributes this massive jump to a vast network of national, private, and international schools established by various global communities. This even included specialized institutes that taught orphans everything from furniture making and printing to classical music performance. The source emphasizes that this highly educated, globally connected populace routinely hosted some massive geopolitical events. A prime example they give is the 1931 Islamic Congress in Jerusalem. For 10 whole days, the city hosted over 150 delegates from about 25 different countries. And they weren't just sitting around discussing local issues either. The documentary notes they were actively coordinating anti-colonial strategies against the French in North Africa and the Levant, the Italians in Libya, and even the British themselves. It was an absolute hub of international political thought.
Which leads us to Section 4, the British Mandate era.
Now, the narrative arc of the documentary pivots here to the disruption of this established society. The film argues that the official start of the British Mandate in 1920 paved the way for significant demographic and administrative changes, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the entire region. According to the documentary, unlike other Arab nations where colonial mandates operated somewhat behind the scenes, in Palestine, the British administration actively facilitated the allocation of economic resources and the processing of immigration paperwork, and they often utilized officials who were explicitly sympathetic to the Zionist movement. To contrast the rapid changes that happened later on, the documentary points out that the early Zionist project was actually quite slow to take hold initially. They cite a very stark statistic to back this up. Between 1882 and 1919, there were only about 2,000 Jewish residents in the greater Jaffa area. The source claims that during those early decades, a lot of immigrants arrived but found the climate, the culture, or the economic conditions just too difficult, and they ended up leaving. The turning point, the documentary argues, was the systemic administrative support provided later by the Mandate authorities.
And that brings us to Section 5, the 1948 infrastructure shift.
This is really the climax of the documentary's historical timeline. Here is where the source directly challenges that empty land narrative we talked about at the top of the explainer. The documentary argues that the idea of arriving in some desolate, empty desert is a complete myth. Instead, the film claims that what actually occurred was the systematic takeover of a deeply advanced, fully functioning, pre-existing society. The wealth, the buildings, the agriculture, it was already there, created by the Palestinian population over decades of development.
The film lists vast amounts of physical infrastructure that were purportedly seized. I mean, we're talking about fully furnished homes where families had just left their belongings behind, operating factories with heavy machinery still inside, functioning, heavily capitalized banks, lush, cultivated citrus farms, cultural centers like cinemas and theaters, and countless religious sites like mosques and churches. According to the documentary, all of this ready-made infrastructure was taken over to immediately serve and house the new waves of immigrants arriving via ships and planes from all around the world.
So how did this massive shift actually become permanent? Well, the documentary breaks it down into a three-step process. First, residents naturally fled the immediate military violence and bombings, just seeking safety for their families. Second, the newly established state created strict legal frameworks, what the documentary forcefully describes as the legalization of theft, to strip these fleeing residents of their property rights. Finally, the properties were reallocated. The source gives this really striking example. Residents of the village of Safaria fled just a few kilometers away to nearby Nazareth to escape the shelling. Yet under these new laws, they were entirely prevented from returning to their homes, their farms, or their businesses, despite being literally just a short walk away. To wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with a question that the documentary inherently asks all of us to ponder. When we look at the sheer scale of the railways, the bustling ports, those soaring literacy rates, and the thriving cultural scene, how does understanding the detailed infrastructure of pre-1948 Palestine change how we view the historical narratives of the region? The source material really challenges us to look beyond simplistic myths and recognize the complex, developed society that existed there, and what it meant when the ownership of that entire society shifted so dramatically. It's a lot to think about. Thanks for joining me as we unpacked this fascinating historical perspective, and I'll catch you in the next one.